Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you to My Jewish Learning for hosting this event, and thank you to Julie for helping to organize it and organizing it. And I also see Dr. Rabbi Aubrey Glazer out there in the boxes, who is the force, one of the big forces behind Panui, and also wrote a beautiful introduction to the book as well, interpretive introduction. So who knows? I might put him on the spot to give some profound interpretation, but I won't torture you, Aubrey. But it's a beautiful thing to have collaborated together in that way, and it's really special and um, um, uh, exciting to see this book come into the world and to be able to share some of it with you. We're going to focus on reading. I'm going to read from a few poems from the book that particularly evoke some of the mystical elements of the creativity that I try to develop here, which is really a kind of contemporary mystical poetry, influenced in great part by my academic subject of focus, which is the history of Kabbalah and Zohar and Jewish mysticism more broadly, and an interest in the literary study of Jewish mysticism. So that kind of dovetails in interesting ways. But Embers of Pilgrimage, this book, which has for those of you who have traveled to the holy place of Sedona, Arizona, might recognize this photo that I took there of Bell Rock, among the many holy spaces and inspirational spiritual spaces of that natural wonderscape. And there's actually a long poem, one of the later poems in the book, called Sedona in Gold and Rust, which is a kind of it's a reflection on all the naturalist beauty and the kind of sacredness, holiness of wandering in that atmosphere. Right, to the climb up Cathedral Rock, right? Cathedral being no coincidence, but also weaved together with a whole variety of images from the Jewish mystical tradition, which is I can't escape it. It's part of my neshama, part of my heart, part of my mind, part of my imagination. So really, this book represents a kind of convergence of both of my academic interest in Jewish mysticism, my interest in literature and poetry, and here is a kind of turn to the practice of poetry, as opposed to, let's say, a critical study of it, and an attempt to craft a new kind of contemporary Jewish mystical language, and to channel some of the great symbols and images and ideas of old, specifically from the Zohar, the great masterpiece of medieval Spanish Jewish mysticism in the late 13th century, and other mystical works, and to kind of weave that together with the very ordinary human, earthly, mortal experience of being human, of love and of loss and of suffering and of family, of fatherhood and sonship, of memory, of time, of hope. And as I mentioned with regard to Sedona, also and that appears in a few different places. Reflections on encounters with the natural world and its own numinosity, its own sacredness, its own ability to open up a kind of eruption of the sacred, of the divine in our experience, but also I would say a kind of meeting point. And one of the things that I think emerges in the work, and both Dr. Glaser and Professor John Burt of Brandeis, who wrote the preface to the work, who is a teacher of mine of long standing, professor of American literature and a poet himself, and a couple of others who have talked with me upon reading it, that part of what's captured in Embers of Pilgrimage, and I think upon reflection, this really is deeply true, is a kind of nexus or a kind of meeting point, kind of crossroads between an experience of the transcendent, right? This experience of the mystery of the divine, of elements of mysticism that might seem somewhat abstract or somewhat heavenly and celestial, and kind of seeing how those actually become embodied or meet our all too human, all too finite, all too mortal experience of what it is to live a human life, to experience suffering, to experience hope, to experience love and joy and eros and so forth. So there's all of that and more in Embers of Pilgrimage, right? The kind of the way in which the mystics represented elements of gender within divinity, eros and sexuality within divinity, and how those elements also manifest or meet with the very human lived experience of those same phenomena that are at the essence of what it is to live a human life, and as the mystics argued, at the very essence also of what it is to think about God and what it is to think about the spiritual life. So we can say at some fundamental level, the poems seek to open up the ways in which our very ordinary experience, our experience of the earthly and the quotidian, right, the ordinary, are also gateways into the sacred, are openings into divine presence, are eruptions of the embers rising into flames of divinity. If God is a kind of multi-layered, multicolored fire, as the mystics sometimes spoke about, at least in some imagery, that parallels the inner, let's say, metaphorical fire of spiritual passion and of all of the different elements of sensation and passion that are part of our very human experience. So what I thought we might do is that I would read to you. It's right. It's not an inauguration of a book of poetry if you don't do some reading from the poetry, of course, right? Because it's also the musical sound, vocal elements of it are a deep part of it. So I'm gonna read two of the poems one at a time. The first one is called Zohar, as a matter of fact, which is on page 50 of the book, and at some point, I think Julie is also going to bring it up on your screen for those of you who are visual visual learners, a little bit more so, which it can be a little bit both, and then to kind of reflect, as I will, also on how in some ways this was inspired by multiple mystical texts, including an important, well-known, at least in certain circles, passage from the Zohar about the eruption of divinity from the depths of cosmic infinity. So fasten your seatbelts, and we're gonna ride a little bit of the mystical roller coaster. Spark overflowing, radiance releasing, infinity unburdened into this wild spectrum of color, mountain of hues, luminous pool, absorbing rivers, converging, hidden within the dark coat of unfathomable depths, night but not night, black but not black, edge of the other side, breaking through, first point of knowing, unknowing, borderlands of the mind, mystified, there the enlightened will shine. Awaken, awaken from a sleep with no dreams. Return, return to your lover between the suns, deep within the hours, the dusk and the early morn, recalling a time before time, when the foretold is remembered. Space with no markers or direction, backdoor opening of the universe in sections where all remains possible and every speech is still unsaid, breath, letters, words hewn from the quarry of pure ether. 32 pathways within, beyond, shrouded in cosmic mist. Sublime rush of river, of light, from endless to bounded, vanishing, revealing, filling the abyss of darkness visible. Then unseen, like the white light that animates, disclosing threads of color, arc of division, luminal fragmentation, flow of one within the panoramic array, prism of all, pathways of the mind. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. So there's a lot to unpack here, and certainly we can. It'll be a delight to have some dialogue about it as well. Let me just first make mention of a few things, even before we go through it a little bit more slowly. That this, this poem is inspired by a number of different mystical texts and ideas. Probably the most dominant one being the Zohar on the beginning of Parashat Breshit, at least as it appears in the printed edition, as the Zohar was printed in the 16th century in Italy. But a kind of imagery of the movement from the ultimate mystery and darkness of absolute infinity into a kind of overflowing of the fountain of color, of division and plurality, multiplicity being birthed from oneness and maintaining its underlying unity, its underlying oneness, right? Which is also, which is touched on in a few places, both certainly at the ending with the echad of the Shema, but also in the image of the white light that contains the full spectrum of color. The image of breaking through and the first point of knowing and unknowing. This is also reflected in a slightly different way in also in the Zohar's reflection on the way in which divinity came to be revealed from ultimate concealment, that there was a kind of first spark of breaking through, and that spark of breaking through for the mystics is called ultimately chokhmah, is called ultimately the sphira, called wisdom, which is the first point of knowing, the first ability that we have to have a glimmer of the divine, of being able to know something of the divine. And there the enlightened will shine. This is also a phrase that we see quite a bit, several times in the Zohar. Their favorite line, perhaps, because it has the word Zohar in it, a line from the book of Daniel, Maskilim yazhiru kazohar harakia, and the wise ones or the enlightened ones will shine like the Zohar, like the radiance of the heavens or the firmament. So let me read this now a second time, and I'll pause as we go, and please feel free if you also have thoughts that you'd like to add as we as we go. We can incorporate that into the discussion. Spark overflowing, radiance releasing, infinity unburdened into this wild spectrum of color. So in the Zoharic image here, there's a kind of imagery and energy of emanation, of flowing forth. It's also the eruption of light, the eruption of the sparks, the eruption of the embers, right? And it's a fountain of hues, a fountain of shades of color. And the Zohar frequently makes a play on a kind of Aramaicized version of river and light. Nehora being Aramaic for light, and Nahara being an Aramaicized version of Nahar. So Nehora din Nehara, right? Which has the same play on the Nun He Resh, as a kind of river of light, a kind of river of divine light. Precisely because the flow of divinity is understood as a kind of emanational, flowing force of this river of divine energy, this river of divine light. Fountain of hues, luminous pool absorbing rivers, and the luminous pool is a kind of gesture also toward Shekhinah, who is the 10th Sphira, who receives all of the converging rivulets of divine energy into her. She is the kind of converging point of all of these energies of the upper levels of divinity, Shekhinah being part of the 10 dimensions of the one God. And hidden within that unfathomable darkness is night but not night, black but not black. This is also characteristic Zoharic attempts at a kind of poetic, mystical paradox. Let me take a dramatic sip of water here. Right, night, but what does it mean to say night but not night, black but not black? And we see this in many cases in the Zohar. It's an attempt to gesture toward something and then to take it away at the same time, right? It is and it isn't. And so there's a kind of in-betweenness, a kind of mystery to the image. It's both something that one can describe and something indescribable. Edge of the other side, breaking through, first point of knowing. Right, so that's very much a play on that passage from the Zohar, where from the depths of complete mystery and darkness there is a first rising of this point that shines, and that first point that shines is the first dimension that can be somehow grasped by the human mind. And yet it is also still wrapped in mystery, unknowing, in the borderlands of the mind, mystified. And it's in that place of mystery, in the in-betweenness, the liminality, right, as Victor Turner would put it, the liminal, the betwixt and between, the in-betweenness of knowing and unknowing is the mystery, is the mystification, is the sense in which that's where spiritual contemplation dwells, somewhere between the ability to know and the elusiveness of true spiritual knowledge of God, right? How much can I really know? How much can I really know through my experience? And there is a kind of almost trance-like state of mystery, a kind of trance-like state of liminality, of betwixt and between, of in-betweenness in the mind. So it's in that place that the enlightened will shine. Shamaskilim yazhiru. They will have their spiritual illumination and awakening. They will have their moment of a kind of enlightenment, of a kind of illumination, of an opening up of spiritual mind, precisely in that state where the unknowable meets the concrete and the knowable. Awaken from a sleep with no dreams. Return to your lover tween the suns. And this is a kind of gesture toward Shekhinah as the dimension of divinity that is like the beloved of the mystic who experiences Shekhinah most powerfully on the eve of Shabbat, in the moment between the suns, bein hashmashot, as already the ancient rabbis say. Right, in the depths of the hours in time, the dusk and the early morn. And just skipping down, just a drop, breath, letters, words, hewn from the quarry of pure ether, 32 pathways within, beyond, shrouded in cosmic mist. This is a kind of gesture towards Sefer Yetzirah, the great mystic book of late antiquity, about how all of reality, all of creation is encoded with a kind of symbolism and engraving of the mystery of divine language and speech. That all of reality, right? And this is particularly powerful when we're thinking about mystical poetry, that all of reality is in fact the very text and texture of divine speech. And if you didn't get that illusion, then you have to read a different poem in the book, or at least my father's first book, which is called Text and Texture. Okay, enough said, you'll figure it out. That all of reality is a kind of divine speech, a kind of divine text that is like the Torah too. And it's hewn paradoxically out of the ether of mystic wonderment. What does it mean to hew something? Like you hew stone from a quarry of ether. And this is what the Zohar and Sefer Yetzirah talk about. That somehow paradoxically, the great language of God that is the maker of all existence, and the letters that are the building blocks of all existence, are somehow mysteriously hewn like rock from the quarry of ether. Right? It's meant to evoke that paradox, that mystery, right? That it's as though the letters are somehow they're pulled from this mystery of pure spirit, in the same way that both the Zohar and later Kabbalists like Moshe Cordovero and Chaim Vital and others talk about souls of people being ultimately hewn from a quarry of ether. Right, so it's an intentional attempt to bring together those paradoxical images, right, of this very concrete, right, hardened image of the hewing from the quarry of rock, and the hewing from the spiritual, and then the 32 pathways within and beyond shrouding cosmic mist. This is also Sefer Yetzirah, Book of Formation allusion, where it says that God created the world and engraved all of the world from the 32 wondrous paths of wisdom. Lamed Bet Nitivot Pliot Chochmah. So there are these mysterious 32 paths of divine mystery, and just to throw in something very practical / humorous, I tried to give this Dvar Torah to my Orthodox dentist, because apparently there are also 32 teeth in the human mouth in most cases. So he really liked that. And there actually are some texts, not one in particular by Isaac of Akko, who I've also written about, who talks about a kind of meditation where one should contemplate the 32 paths of mysterious wisdom of God while pressing one's tongue against one's teeth, precisely because of the 32 teeth of the human mouth. I know everybody's counting their teeth right now to see whether this is correct, but okay. So there's a kind of disclosure of color and of this luminal fragmentation, this opening up, just like the ways in which the white light, right? And I say this as somebody with very basic knowledge of the way in which the physics of light works, right? And I was particularly, not to minimize it, but I was particularly excited to see this highlighted, no pun intended, in one of the great children's book series of all time, the Magic School Bus series, right? Where there's this amazing representation of how a spectrum that is sometimes manifest as the rainbow, or of the many different colors of light, emerges from the one white light, which hides all of that division. And that's to some extent like this experience of multiplicity being opened up from within the oneness of everything, and that there is this deep oneness that underlies it all. And so Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, right? The essence of reality is that oneness of everything, from which there is a multiplicity that flows. So that I don't just keep talking before we turn to Light of Before, if we have time. I wanted to see if as we were reading this, discussing this, as you're looking at it, you had some thoughts. I'm not going to particularly single out Dr. Glazer. So don't worry, that's not me singling you out, Aubrey. But anybody who has any thoughts as you were reading this, what struck you, what images, what lines were particularly evocative for you, and why?
Hi, I had a process meta question, which can wait till the end, if there's time at the end.
Okay, sure. Were there other hands up yet?
Not that I see. Anyone have a comment or a question?
And I know it's brewing within you, like the light within, but it takes time to settle. And maybe while you're formulating your thought and your comment, I see Sharon Peterson. Did I get that right? And please.
My background is a Christian culture. And what you have described, the first place that Christians' contemplation starts from is a place of unknowing. That the humility of unknowing is, as you would describe it, the eruption into a different kind of knowing, which is what you're describing. I mean, it was amazing as you talked, the convergence.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think, and it's deeply true, right? Whether it's the cloud of unknowing, right, or whether it's other elements in the way in which Neoplatonism, right, creative adaptations of Plato that took place in third century Rome and beyond, which ultimately influenced heavily Christian thinking and Jewish thinking, and Arabic thinking, Muslim thinking as well. The Zohar, to some extent, is rightfully called by some a kind of Jewish Neoplatonism. Or at the very least, it's heavily influenced by that. But what does that really mean, right? In terms beyond the fancy term Neoplatonism, there is this kind of, as you were just mentioning, this mystery of the passage from a kind of state of unknowing, which perhaps we can characterize as a kind of stunned wonderment before the vastness of all, right? Which which the mystics talk about, which some theologians who might or might not be here have talked about, and others, right? That we begin in that state of radical unknowing, right, as we stand before the mystery of existence, and then there is this gradual transition into knowing, into an attempt to put the unspeakable, the unsayable into words, to lift that language that is encoded in 32 wondrous pathways of wisdom within reality, right, to riff on Sefer Yetzirah, and to lift it out into a language that can be spoken and understood, right? Or as we take that primal, deep, soulful experience of standing in the presence of the numinous, of the wondrous, of the mystery of divinity, that we make this transition to the first spark, the first ember of, or sparks flying from embers, right? As Aubrey and I have talked about before. Almost like sparks flying from embers within consciousness, within the mind. I see a hand raised by a Dr. Mona Fishbane. You have a very familiar sounding name. Yes, please.
Hopefully the face is familiar too. Thank you so much. This is just wonderful and really.
And I like the Sedona poster in the background.
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah, right. There's Sedona. It's a family thing, right? This is sort of a good introduction to me for the Zohar, which I need to learn. But I think that there's this whole flow and the humility of not knowing, and the borderlands, the sort of it's ephemeral. You can't quite hold it, but you're trying. Is such an antidote to our grasping culture. And I don't mean to sound too Buddhist here, but it's, normally we cut things into we grasp and we cut and we define. And this is such a very different way of looking at the world. It's really powerful.
So that we live. Thank you, beautiful, and so that we live in this kind of in between borderland, if you will, right, between the mystery of unknowing and the ability to bring things to a state of speech and articulation, and that it's almost as though the very process of naming, right? Like if we think about the image of Adam HaRishon, of first Adam naming the creatures, right? There's a kind of naming that happens in this moment of a movement from this radical mystery that's represented by the infinite darkness of this, to the first sparks of knowledge and imagination, and turning spiritual wonderment into spiritual language. So I want to make sure that I'm not missing a hand. I see one thing that popped up.
Ellen?
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your beautiful presentation of your amazing poetry. I wanted to comment on the 32 paths, and just clarify that it is the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet plus the 10 sphirot. Is that how the 32
Yes.
arises?
Thank you very much for pointing that out. Right, it's actually very important, because for Sefer Yetzirah in particular, basically it was fundamentally that reality, the created reality, is also made up of a kind of, the deep structure of reality is both linguistic right, of the letters and language, and numerological, right? So I guess that's both sides of your of the brain, right? Your math brain and your poetry language brain. But absolutely, the 10 sphere, both in terms of all of the variations of how the 10 stands at the essence of that numerology that the Kabbalists were very fond of, but also that the 10 are the 10 dimensions of the one God, right? If we talk about kind of the culmination of this poem as of the line of the Shema, of the Echad, it's the Echad, the oneness that actually contains the 10. And then that 10, it's almost as though that 10 imbues or is the very soul of the spiritual animation and vivification, life force of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So absolutely, right? It's kind of that's how divinity therefore shines through Hebrew language in particular, of sacred Hebrew language in particular. So thank you very much for yes.
Can I just add one more that, so the 32 is Lamed Bet, as I think you mentioned, and
Yes.
that's Lev and
Yes.
heart and
Yes,
love.
beautiful. Yes,
So it
yes.
all comes from.
Yes, absolutely. Wow, fantastic. And I think that's 100% true. And there have been various mystics who have also latched on to that correlation as well. So you're definitely thinking like a mystic and a poet in all of those ways. I think that's very true. Right? It's the heart, in that sense. It's the heart of language, the heart of reality. It's the Lamed Bet, and it's the heart that also represents this deep emotion as well, right? Both representationally and then, as we've learned, neurobiologically, it's related too. But I'm not going to go down that path. So I want. So thank you so much. I see a hand from Dr. Rabbi Glazer, and he has spent a lot of time thinking about these poems also. So I would really love to hear what you have to say, Aubrey.
Thank you, Eitan. It's so wonderful to be able to hear the words come alive and to see the interaction and the inspiration that you're sharing with us. So thank you so much. I just wanted to know if you could, for maybe a brief moment, share with us what the process of writing this poetry was like for you as both a scholar of mysticism as well as a poet, and just the challenges of being able to render this language, especially that you're bringing in this poem as well as in 40 Faces and some of the other poems in the collection, of trying to render such an arcane and esoteric language in the pseudo-Aramaic into the mellifluous American English that you're bringing to us, which really is what drew me so deeply to the poetry the first time I read it. What was that process like? What were the challenges that you faced and the surprises that you encountered along the way?
Thank you for that. I think in some ways there is that element of some of that element that I was alluding to earlier, also of how this, which we've talked about before, right? This kind of crossroads of the transcendent, or of this kind of seemingly or not just seemingly abstract, deeply mythological kind of metaphysical poetry, right? Which certainly has its own precedent in both Jewish and non-Jewish poetry, and then how that kind of imbues our earthly experience, or in this case, in crafting it really specifically as a kind of Jewish English poetry, right? As a kind of American poetry. Where does it fit into all of that, right? And Aubrey does a beautiful job of situating that in his interpretive introduction to this volume, which I think all of you will love reading, right? Which is really about this sense of which is also related to what right. I mean, Aubrey talks a lot about Harold Bloom's layers of theory with regard to poetry, but I'm thinking specifically about the idea of the American sublime, right, and how that relates to a poet like Whitman or to others, right, where there's a kind of the sublime being fundamentally this kind of moment where the deep mysteries of the unsayable or the seemingly unsayable or of wonderment, right, or as Kant, right, Immanuel Kant talked about the sublime as standing before the waterfall, or right, this kind of overwhelming spiritual experience in some cases of the natural, right? So that's also where that plays into it. So here there's a kind of sense of kind of trying to, I think, channel the correlation of that mystical heritage, which is somehow nistar at some level, hidden at some deep level in its Aramaic, in its though now we didn't actually get to that part of the PDF, and we probably won't, but it has now been translated beautifully by Daniel Matt, and then also in the last 3 volumes of the 12-volume Pritzker edition by Joel Hecker and Nathan Walsky, published by Stanford University Press. So the whole I wouldn't say the whole of Zoharic literature, because there are other elements that haven't yet been done, but the heart of it has certainly been translated and commented upon in 12 really rich volumes, which many of you are probably already familiar with, and I encourage you to dive into that. And you can see especially his translation and commentary on Zohar volume 1 15a, which is in volume 1. It's at the beginning of Parshat Breshit of the Zohar, is a kind of the Zohar's version of some of this, or I should say my reflection is a kind of perush in its own way, kind of poetic interpretation of that Zoharic sublime vision, right? The vision of the sublime and its adaptation into a deeply, what I hope is, and what you've also helped me see, Aubrey, the kind of the American poetic language of that, right, and how that reflects that experience, which is both its Jewishness and its Americanism, which is very much part of this volume, I think, right? So Sedona being a big example of that, but not only, for sure. Thank you so much. I see. So maybe we'll circle back to Jay Yair. I'm not sure what you go by, but please.
Thanks. Aubrey kind of went in the direction I wanted to go in the sort of meta process comments. And hi, Aubrey. Hi, Aubrey. It's been a while, and hi, Mona and Buzzy. It's been even a greater while. As someone who also writes and publishes poetry, I struggle constantly with the question of how much literacy, in my case, the Hebrew Bible and Midrash, can you assume on the part of the reader? It seems in your work that's kind of raising the stake asymptotically in terms of the knowledge base that's required. So what have you thought about how much to tell, where to publish? Are there other ways? Because even in your explanation today, my gosh, the levels that I was able to go through just hearing your explanation in terms of what's on the page is almost a cavernous gap. And so how, as a writer could you address those kinds of gaps?
Thank you. It was fantastic, and I'm really glad you mentioned this. And this actually relates to as Aubrey and I have been talking about this volume for quite some time, and at his suggestion, I ended up writing, and Aubrey had did some beautiful editing and reflections on this also in the end notes to this volume. So things like that So there's a long section of endnotes. It's not the same as academic footnotes, I would say. You might say, thank God, right? Though I do love a good academic footnote, I have to say, right? Okay, but that's really my issue. These are endnotes that kind of seek like some other works, right? And another example of this is right, Lehavdil, Bob Alter's, Uri Alter's collection and translation of Amichai, without making any comparisons. His attempt to there also is the endnotes are, right, the many readers, especially American or English reading readers, might not necessarily get all of the scriptural or rabbinic or other types of allusions that are in Amichai's poetry, right? And so some of that is there. Here's a different type of question, but I try where there's something that I think would be particularly enigmatic to somebody who wasn't familiar with this, that I at least gesture toward some explanation of that in the endnotes, at least to get that started. So we just have a few more minutes. I'm not sure if it makes sense to start in with another whole poem, Julie. Probably not. I could look at a little bit of it, just to share one image of this, right? Which is the second poem, which is Light of Before. Is based on an idea you find already in rabbinic Agadah, perhaps most famously in Bavli Chagiga, right? I think it's 11b, around there, where it talks about a kind of primordial light, 12a, right? A kind of primordial light that was created at the moment of Vayehi Or, and that was then hidden inside the Torah for the righteous in the world to come, for all kinds of reasons. But there was like this primordial light, and this was that God created, and this was very appealing to the mystics. You could, as you might imagine, already from this taste, right, or from your own knowledge. The idea that there is a kind of inner light, right, which was appealing to many spiritual teachers and students and thinkers, right? But there's a kind of inner divine light to all of existence, and that light already was, or the Kvar Hava is the Zoharic, right? That's actually why I chose this translation, right? The light that already. The light that already was. Maybe I'll just read just a little bit of this, just so you can get a sense of that, just a taste of that poem with that idea in mind. Light of before, flame igniting, erupting holiness through dark lands of journey, divine light, light that already was. Spark of before, and arc toward that will be. Shine before sunlit origins, portal into knowing's unknowing. There that is again, right? First point rising from the vast ocean of timelessness. Sea of darkness. Wisdom shuddered and then spun out like silk, past that is forever becoming, whether flowering and thriving or decaying and dying, into the beyond that was before. Flame that is bound to the coal. I interrupt myself just to say that's that's a line that's directly from Sefer Yetzirah. Flame that is bound to the coal. Inseparable glimpse of infinity. Layered light revealing and concealing the same. If you hear a little Whitman in there, that was intentional. Blue below, darkened lens, cosmic table set. Blue below is also the Shekhinah, who is the lowest of the layers of flame. Right, when you see the top is the white light, then the black light, then the blue light. If you look at a flame, though, and the Kabbalists reflect on this. And we're going to finish up in just a second because I know we're just about out of time. With black draped as cloth upon her, white light shining pure above them both, right? So that's my reference to those layers of the flame, opening into the realm that lies within, luminal rungs leading to palaces of pearl and marble. It's a little bit of a Merkava mysticism reference. To those for whom that makes any sense. End to end of the earth. That's actually already in the older version of the light that already was. You could see Misofa Olam Ba'ad Sofo is already in Bavli Chagiga through that light. End to end of the earth envisioned and held in primordial letters of fire, Torah word, illuminating and birthing all that will be. The is of becoming and future gazing, shelter of redemption, dreamed in the near sleepless night. Window opened from the airless room and rush of warm ocean breezes. And I'll tell you here, I didn't say this, I think, in the endnotes, but I was inspired by the beginning of Paul Bowles' "The Sheltering Sky" in that little stanza. So you get a little peek into my influences, flowing over him like a rinsing of spirit from the pre-dawn darkness of the beach. Hope that rises like a bubble of air from below the surface of water, alone in the wilderness. So we could certainly unpack that at great length, but I know that we're already a couple minutes past our time, and I don't want to stress Julie out. What's your thought, Julie? Should we end there, or do we have time for a couple of thoughts on
yeah,
this
we
call?
can take a thought or two. We should wrap up soon. Anyone, whether from you, Dr. Fishbane, or from any of the participants, I don't know what you were thinking, but yeah, go ahead.
I'd prefer if anybody has any initial thoughts of that to hear you, though I know sometimes it takes a little time for these things to sink in.
Yeah, I know some people have to leave on the hour for the next Zoom event.
Yes. So
but if anyone has thoughts that they want to share, so maybe a closing thought from
so just in closing, that the part of this imagery which seeks to take the Or HaGanuz, as it's referred to both in the rabbinic literature and then certainly in the later mystical literature, the hidden light that opens into a kind of timelessness, right? A kind of sense of that which is both before and after, that which is remembered and hoped for, the kind of circle of time, and this is also and that is also a reflection of the very nature of the human life, right? That we are on this process of from being born to dying, right? And I can't help but think about the Bob Dylan lyrics, right? He not busy being born is busy dying. From it's all right, Mom. For anybody for whom that association works, that there's a sense in which the very circle of our mortality, right, the circle of our experience of time in this life is like the circle of time that the light represents, the kind of the depths of the primordial of that which comes before, in the time before time, right? This light that was before Or de Kfar Hava, and it's also the Torah that is inscribed into the world, because the Torah also is understood to pre-exist creation. And that's a much longer story, like the Christian image of the word, of the logos. So they're deeply related, as Daniel Boyarin has shown, right? So that there's this illuminated Torah that stands at the beginning of time, and that is the promise of redemption, and that is the path that is walked, the language, the texture, the text of our mortal trek, to quote another line from somewhere in this volume. But maybe that's a good place to close, and just to say that each of us, right, in between our unknowing and our knowing, in between our memory and our hope, in between our suffering and our joy, right, there is that illuminated word of God, of Torah, that dwells within, that is yearning to be birthed again through imagination and through creativity and through spiritual experience. So I wish all of you much illumination on your own paths of learning and discovery, and thank you again to My Jewish Learning, to Julie, and to all of you for sharing some time talking about Embers of Pilgrimage.